So I will talk to you today, as Matt mentioned. Thank you for coming, first of all. I will speak today about an installation that I produced a few years ago in 2013. And this is an installation that I actually like to talk of as a drawing rather than an installation in terms of its medium. But it proposes an alternative type of drawing and of thinking about drawing, and specifically of how you draw the city. So, the talk will be going around and about the ideas of the city map, the representation of the city, but also the idea of the image. Can you hear? A bit louder? Is this better? Yeah? Let's do this. Okay. So, I was saying that although I will be talking about drawing, the notion of the image is quite important into my thinking about putting forward this idea. And so this project was part of a bigger project that was looking at how we draw cities. But the particular problematization of this drawing had to do with the idea that, on one hand, the city is a transitory condition, is not fixed and static as conventional architectural drawings will have us contend. But then, so there is a kind of physical movement that goes around in the city, but there is also a kind of change that is derived by how we perceive the city and how we look at the city, not only as architects, but also as city dwellers, as people who experience the city from within and from below. So I was interested in how, as an architect, the way that the tools that I had at hand to draw the city through the parallel projection of the plant as a primary tool, kind of contradicts and lives outside of its thinking and of its scope. Other forms of, other types of images and narratives and perceptions that come from popular culture, come from subjective experience, from in situ experience of the city, but also come from other modes of representation that we find in other sciences, such as geology or astronomy and so on. So to this end, I will speak to you a little bit about the history of urban representation before going into the project, and how it, and put forward the question of how architecture sits within this, and how at some point architecture becomes a primary stakeholder in constructing how we perceive the cities, and consequently how we design them and how we live in them. So architectural representation, not architectural representation, urban representation up to the 1500s was really not about plans and maps, was rather about what sometimes historians call the city portrait, which is something that what you can see on the left side by Jacopo de Barbari, a very well-known drawing which presents a view of Venice. So until that stage, the city was understood more as a political entity, as a civic entity as well. So representations were not concerned with accuracy and with geometric allocations of volumes, but rather with presenting the portrait of the city as in putting forward the primary traits of the city as an individual, as something that had a character. So from the 1500s onwards, with the shifting to a more classical way of thinking and of drawing, not only in terms of cities, but of representing space as well, we begin to shift into the aspect of the plan that begins to be able to show as we know as architects, through parallel projection, more accurate representations of the city as a volume. So as a material, as material mass that is kind of determined. And by doing this, it also brings the urban space into the field of visibility of the architect and the designer, and allows therefore for different kinds of interventions into the urban mass. So this suggests this kind of juxtaposition of, on one hand, a drawing that is more about impressions, more about how things look, how you perceive of them, and the other one that is about a more abstract view, but is about conveying some sort of mathematical accuracy of what the object that you're looking at proposes a kind of controversy, a kind of juxtaposition that is quite common, has been quite prevalent in the history of architectural thinking since its establishment as a kind of a more defined discipline in the Renaissance. So you can say that with the emergence of the plan as a way of drawing, as a primary, a dominant way of drawing the city, that not only does the city become more actively the object of the planner and the architect, but also it begins to kind of drive how people understand spatial distances and configurations of urban environments. But this suggests as well another kind of division. On one hand, the one is about visual resemblance, and the other one is about material annotation, in a sense, material notation. So for me, this was what was really the problematic that drove my research, that had to do with the things that we as architects live outside of our representations. And that doesn't have to do only with the scale of the city. It also involves smaller scales of intervention. But I thought that the city was a particular interesting field for looking at this because of how because of kind of presenting almost the highest possible complexity of an architectural ensemble. So to this kind of line of inquiry that I was following in order to kind of approach a different kind of representation that was kind of setting aside these kind of preconceptions about what is made visually present in our representations, which, following the conventions of architectural drawing, would be that is materially constant and present, so that is not only tangible, but also endures and is fixed and static over time. So activities, but also other fleeting ideas of the city, such as narratives and myths and stories, were cast aside and were not considered to be valid enough to make it into our understanding of the city, even though they would construct its cultural context and content. So I was quite interested then into the discussion of the city portrait and the city map by a French theorist, Louis Marin. And he's kind of putting forward of the idea that the city map, and he uses in the more wider encompassing way, where he brings together the portrait and the map, is a kind of a construct. So it is something that we construct, and it is not about some sort of definite truth, that has a kind of double, dual-sided, double way of operating. So he said it is at once the trace of a residual past. So it is about recollecting things, it's about finding things that are there, but it's also the structure for a future to be produced. And he was saying that, in truth, maps, the value of maps as devices for acquiring knowledge, because this is what we try to do by representing things. We're trying to get to know them and to hold them and to understand them, that maps have this kind of duality of register that lets them operate through means of both description, so describing things, how they are, which kind of would bring us closer to the idea of impression and resemblance that we find in the portrait, but also through symbolic aspects that have to do with narration, that have to do with recoding things in a certain way. So you can think of a map of the plan as a kind of coded representation that is not about imitating how things look. So you cannot find ever that view from above that you have in the plan. It's something that is completely constructed. But yet, through this kind of symbolic representation, it reveals new things and allows room for other kinds of speculations. So, as I said, in architectural representation, this abstraction, however, this use of the symbolic has been for a very long time, for centuries now, tied to the idea of a scientific approach to our surroundings. So one of the earliest city maps is that of Leonardo da Vinci. You can see on the left. Yeah, that's the left. Which was basically gradually constructed by taking measurements from a central point in the city of Imola. So it was more about the method of measuring rather than about a position of looking. So if in the portrait you can imagine that you can understand who would be looking at this drawing and which side they would be looking at it from some view from high above, even if that is ideal. Plans and even in the very earliest iterations had to do more with the method of recording data and information. But as you can see from one of the most celebrated plans ever made, the Noli plan of Rome, which I'm sure you all know. And even though what was revolutionary about it had to do more with a revisiting of what public space entails, I think that in architectural pedagogy and practice, more often we find the reference to the Noli plan as having to do with the understanding of the city as something that is divided in two states, materially solid and materially void. So there is a privileging of the material in architectural drawing. So to this, I would like to come a couple of 3-4 centuries forward from the Renaissance and the establishment of the plan as a dominant paradigm for how we draw cities a bit later, into the emergence of what we now understand as the modern city, and look a bit at not how the city was looked at from afar, but how the city was lived in from inside, which is what I think is one of the things that my drawing is countering as missing from the conventions of architectural representation. So to this point, I would like to quote, to bring to your attention a bit of the discussion about the flaneur, which has been discussed widely by Charles Baudelaire in his poetry and in his writings, but later on more closer to us by Walter Benjamin. And this is a character that kind of represents, let's say, the dweller of the modern city, so of the city of Paris in particular, because it is a kind of a character emerging from 18th century Paris. And it is a character that kind of represents this feeling of alienation that city dwellers experienced in the cities that were kind of growing and changing very rapidly in in light rather than the shadow of the Industrial Revolution. So imagine that Paris, in particular, at the time was kind of undergoing a vast urban regeneration project. There were parts of the city that were completely demolished. There were main arteries redesigned. But there were also new types of experiences emerging in the city, such as the arcades that were the shopping streets, interiorized, and so on. So, so that was the specific situation of the flaneur. But I think there are some aspects of it that apply into a wider understanding of the agency of the city dweller in the understanding of the urban. So Baudelaire wrote of the flaneur that we might liken him to a mirror as vast as the crowd itself, or to a kaleidoscope gifted with consciousness, responding to each one of its movements and reproducing the multiplicity of life and the flickering grace of the elements of life. So the discussion of not only the city in modernity, in the dawn of modernity, but later on as well in how modernity cultivated a new culture of urban life, but also of visuality as well at the same time. Sorry, I'll go back to that. Brings forward a notion of multiplicity, to quote Baudelaire, and kind of portrays the city as this more clearly as a space that is in constant flux, that is changing, and within which the urban dweller as a kind of immediate subject, someone who is directly experiencing the city, is also part of this image of the city itself, but also has an agency in, there is a kind of reciprocal relation between the object and the subject, between the city and the person who is looking at the city and experiencing it. So within modernity, this discussion of, you can imagine that with the industrial development of production, there was a rapid kind of, a series of rapid developments in terms of devices of looking. Because what we have been talking about so far is really about modalities of looking. So how drawings look, how the imaginary subject of a drawing looks at something, but also how the immediate experience of the city comes down to certain sensory, visual as well, but not strictly, ways of relating to the urban context, to our surroundings. So, in the, particularly in the 19th century, we had a series of rapid developments in terms of optical devices. So there was the invention of photography, there was the invention of, well, the grounds for the invention of cinema at the very end of the century, but also other kinds of devices such as stereoscopes and dioramas, the phenakistoscope and so on, that kind of, on one hand, created kind of extensions of our vision. So they made us feel like, oh, we can capture the world in so much more ways, and that way we can attain more. It's almost like we become this kind of, we acquire an extended type of perception. But at the same time, by uncovering this kind of, by offering this extension of our vision, they also uncovered the limitations of our perception. So they made us realize that, perhaps the world was not exactly what we thought it was, and they kind of brought to the fore again this question of what is materially present and what is visually present. So how does the matter and its visual manifestation, impression, how do these two correlate? And this was widely explored, particularly from modernist artists such as the futurists as well, which I'm not included here, but also the cubists quite a lot in terms of thinking of how, thinking about constancy, so how different options of an object are sutured together to construct our understanding of an object by looking at different ways and so on. So yeah, I will skip this and I will come back later to that. This kind of shed some light into the idea of perception not being only about visibility and not really only being about multiplicity, as Baudelaire said, but about really perception being this really embodied process. And this is something that we have seen already in earlier types of representation, so the city portrait I was talking about primarily. And many times in these earlier types of drawings, you can see how this relationship of the viewer, the imagined viewer of the map, so if you were to look at the camera, the person who is looking through the camera of that photo, being represented within the drawing. So for instance, in the top you can see, I never remember that name, Lucantonio degli Uberti's view of Florence, whereby the draftsman is depicted actually at the end of the bottom right corner of the drawing. And this kind of suggests that there is, it's almost as if the land, the terrain of the city becomes a kind of prosthesis to, there is a continuity between the viewer and the object that he's looking at. And therefore we have a clear suggestion of what is the established looking relationship to the subject. On the other hand, we could also have other types of representation whereby the subject was not identified with the draftsman, the producer of the drawing, but with the people that embodied not only the physical aspect of the city, but also the social. So in Merian's map of Paris that you see below, the map of the city was not only about drawing the buildings and the streets, but it was also about representing the different types of citizens that you could find in that city at the time. So this kind of leads me to this thinking that drawing is not only about how we look at the city, but is itself a kind of embodied process. So there is an embodied kind of aspect in the experience of the city, but there is also as well an embodied aspect equally in how we construct the drawing and how we then read and experience the city through the drawing itself. So it's almost like a kind of lens, you might say. But that would still be an oversimplification because if you consider the very early manifestations of drawings, for instance, of the medieval masons, you would consider that they would actually draw things in situ and construct buildings on site from the drawings they would scrape on the floor. So drawing is about a way of looking at the real, but it's also about a way of constructing on the real. And this, in both cases, requires the direct engagement of the architect as not a builder of the drawing, but as someone who also reads the drawing, so comes to re-inhabit it and reappropriate it in some way. Vision in that context, if we go back into the kind of modernist understanding of the city and Baudelaire's discussion, through the side of modernity that had to do with uncovering the movement of the city through optical devices and through the ways we look at things, but also through other types of technology that had to do with locomotion, with being able to fly above spaces, places, with being able to move faster across things, made more prominent the idea that that vision and, by consequence, visuality is not only about a practical method of measuring and of capturing things, but it's also a kind of social fact in itself, in the sense that it is driven as well by political ideas, by aspects of defining how we look at things. And consequently, we can consider this perhaps in a sense of vision, of this collective vision that drawings and maps construct, as ways of ordering somehow what the real is. So particular architectural maps of plan view maps of drawings, we can think of them as a way of kind of putting this kind of chaotic multiplicity of the city into some sort of visual order that we can then take as architects and manipulate. Some references to film as well, which was very, very prominent in kind of raising discussions about perception and about our positioning into the city. And eventually as well, long exposure photography, in terms of revealing that what is present visually is not, this kind of is more about suggesting this idea of time and duration that you can see, for instance, in this image by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, that form is not directly bound to matter, but form can also emerge from light or can also emerge from movement. So it comes down again to this question between what is present, the material or that which is perceived. And this is where the idea of image becomes, again, prominent, because one of the personalities that kind of took on this discussion of perception in modernity was French philosopher Henri Bergson, who kind of offers to us this idea of the image as something that is not strictly visual and it's not strictly material, but rather what he did was, through his writing, establish an understanding of our mental to the very physiological aspects of perception as something that connects the mental images that we produce by perceiving or by looking at things with our physiological state. And so he suggested that perception, all kinds of experience, either if they are mentally produced or materially present, can be understood through the idea of the image. But there is a difference, not of kind between the material and the visual, but there is a difference of degree. So there are the two edges, matter and the material and the visual, and you can have images that are more material or images that are less material and more mental. And he related this, specifically he talked about the matter and memory kind of referring to consciousness. So taking into account this idea of the image as something that can accommodate both the material and the mental, can help us revisit a bit the idea of the image of the city and consider that it can and possibly even needs to be open into other types of subject matter that don't have to do only with the physical form, but can accommodate for other types of perception and impressions of the city that emerge from the cultural and the experiential. So, coming now to the discussion of my drawing, which is called the Kaleidoscopic City. This kind of draws, on one hand, from, I mentioned that Baudelaire used the analogy of the kaleidoscope to talk about the city dweller and the immediate experience of the urban. And he was saying that there is a kind of, his emphasis was on the multiplicity and the movement, and the idea that for every movement that you act upon, in essence, your perception of your surrounding changes, or so in that sense, the city itself changes somehow. The kaleidoscope, we if we look at it in terms of the intentions and the impressions of the people who devised it, Sir David Brewster on one hand in Scotland, because there was two people that invented it almost simultaneously. So in Scotland, Sir David Brewster was talking about the kaleidoscope. He discovered it by accident, and he was talking about it as a kind of scientific toy, but he was also talking about it as a kind of way of mechanically reproducing beautiful images, what it's called. And in that sense, he was saying this could very well substitute painting. And this was based on a very kind of rationalist and idea that beauty is about precision and accuracy. So what really enticed Brewster in terms of the kaleidoscope was not its multiplicity and its ability to produce things, its possibility of changing things, but rather it is its ability to do so while maintaining a kind of visual symmetry. So for Brewster, what was primary was again this idea of the kaleidoscope as a device that imposes order. I'm sure you all know what a kaleidoscope is, eh? Yeah? Fidel knows? Yeah, okay, you sort of know, most of you know. Okay, so for Brewster, what was interesting about the kaleidoscope was the symmetry, which was a criterion for beauty. So we come again to this idea that there is an ordering in what you look at. But if you imagine what the kaleidoscope really is, you can as well have inside bits of debris. So there's, you can have the most banal and mundane and cheap object inside it. But through this looking, it will be ordered in a specific way that, according to Brewster, qualifies as beautiful because it's symmetrical. On the other hand, however, in France, Alphonse Giroux was also trying to get the patent for the kaleidoscope. So there was a bit of a controversy there on who found it first. But he didn't call it the kaleidoscope. Let me tell you here that kaleidoscope comes from the Greek words kalos και skopeo, skopo, which means to, it kind of means to look at things in a good way or to make things good as you look at them. So you can clearly see there that this kind of idea of the lens as something that reconstructs that what it looks at. So it's not objective. It is. It has a direct impact on what it looks at and what it frames. So Alphonse Giroux talked about the transfigurator. He was saying that. He was saying that you can place all of these banal pieces of clothes, debris, rubbish, whatever. The objects mingling are combined before the eye in thousands of ways, always regular but never alike, produced by the meeting of three lenses in a triangular arrangement along the entire length of the tube. So for Giroux, it was more about this idea of transfiguring things. He was more conscious of the idea that, in his descriptions, of the idea that he was acting upon the things he was looking at in a certain way. Again here, Bergson talking about the, coincidentally, used himself the idea of the kaleidoscope as an analogy for how human perception operates, and in a very eerie way, echoing what Baudelaire was saying, that that there's the agency of not only our physical movement, but also as well of our mental capacity to kind of to have kind of some sort of impact on what we are perceiving, what we're looking at. So what I'm interested in terms of the kaleidoscope is that it kind of brings in this idea of this juxtaposition of the ordered and the disordered, which I think is really what defines our understanding of cities. Because on one hand, they emerge out of the intertwining of multiple subjectivities. So individual subjectivities that have to do with immediate experiences or with personal recollections, and memories, but also subjectivities that have to do with the devices to be used to represent things and to look at things. And all of these, and the city is really none of them individually, but rather it is something that emerges in the superposition of all of these things. And I was very interested in this idea of Brewster's, of the kaleidoscope that Brewster had, that as a scientific toy, because toy, the kaleidoscope per se might be about ordering things in a visual way, but of looking at messy things in an ordered way. But at the same time, as Baudelaire wrote elsewhere, the toy itself, it's about a process of finding things out and getting to know things, and children commonly are known for breaking up their toys and putting them back together. So what is important here for me is the idea that through the kaleidoscope there is an active decomposing of the image and recomposing it. So breaking it apart and putting it back together in a way to understand how it works. So this is what I tried to do then with Kaleidoscopic City. I tried to look at how drawing works, how drawing of the city works. And in order to do that, I kind of devised this, these rules for looking at a square of the city that was 1.5 kilometers long on either side. How are we doing in terms of time?
You've got 20 minutes.
Okay, good. So I was looking at the city of Edinburgh, which was where I was staying and studying at the time. And it was also the birthplace of the kaleidoscope on its Scottish side, because I don't know where's the roof from, but David Brewster was active in Edinburgh. I was looking at producing a drawing of the city centre of Edinburgh that would kind of take into account this idea of the urban being a kind of transitory condition. And I had before that conducted an experiment that had to do with looking at a smaller urban site that was 15 meters square. But so that helped me kind of devise certain ideas about notation, about how I would annotate things, how I would draw them by means of lines so they would become architectural. But the real question here, when I moved from a site of 15 meters to 1.5 kilometers, was again the subject matter. So what I was looking at, not how I was going to draw it, but what I was going to include in my drawing. So what processes of selection what would be my criteria of presence, if we go back to the earlier discussion? Is it visual? Is it material? Is it both at the same time? So in order to do this, I have here an image from Charles and Ray Eames's film Powers of 10, which was something that I was really interested in terms of how it kind of sets away any preconception of technological scale. And it is, so this is a film that presents an aerial view, so assimilating the plan a little bit, of a couple having a picnic in a park. And then it starts zooming out and out and out in powers of 10. So it goes from 10 meters to 100 meters to 1,000 meters and so on and so on. And then it ends up in outer space. But still, the focus, the center of this representation is that original couple, right? And then it starts zooming in by going down in powers of 10 until it even comes to the surface of the skin. And then it goes inside the skin and so on and so forth. So this is kind of serving to tell us that, to highlight a little bit the preconceptions that scale alone introduces in architectural drawing. Because even though things might not be able to coexist in graphic scales, and graphic scales have to do, again, with measuring the physical, the size, the material presence, they do interact and they do correlate across these scales. So this was the site of investigation that I chose to engage with. And because this was not about a specific project, the project itself was to explore architectural representation of the architectural representation of the city. I don't know if you are familiar with Edinburgh at all, but I didn't have any restriction of where my site was, but I thought I would start from the more central area, because if I'm talking about the image of the city, probably this is the most charged area, the one that has been recorded the most, the one that kind of is more representative of what Edinburgh stands to be in a collective consciousness. So looking at this part of the city and taking into account the things that we talked about earlier, I started thinking about how my architectural perception of the city could be enriched by including other perceptions, the views of other subjects around the city. And I started looking a bit at the physical presence of the city itself, so its land and its buildings, and how they looked at the city to begin with. So I located into the city 6 sites. Some of them were within the area that I was looking, some of them were outside, that kind of established some sort of visual relationship to the city that was culturally prominent, so it was acknowledged in a wider cultural context. So if you have been to Edinburgh, these are the Calton Hill. So 4 of them were hills. Edinburgh is a very hilly place, not in the same way as Bristol though. So Calton Hill at the top, I will go into more detail about that. Arthur's Seat in the east. At the south, the Royal Observatory Hill. And within the area of investigation itself, the National Museum, the Camera Obscura Tower, and the Edinburgh Castle. So all of these, you would be able to tell they are high points. So in that sense, they remain quite close physically to the idea of the city portrait as a bird's eye view, and to the map as an aerial view. But I chose this because each one of them was related to some sort of prominently disseminated image of the city. So for instance, the Royal Observatory, which I have misspelled here, sorry, had to do with the sky map. So it was kind of turning attention away from the land as the primary point of attention and into the sky, thinking that the movement of the stars was quite definitive in this idea of duration and the change of time. And it was also related thus into a kind of representation, because the sky astronomy has a specific way of producing sky maps that have similar conventions to, not similar, that similarly to architectural drawing have conventions. Then I was looking at the observation tower of the Camera Obscura, because relating it to the idea of the aerial view, because of how the Camera Obscura kind of tries to imitate that in some sense. I was looking at Calton Hill because it was the place that inspired the construction of the first ever panorama. You're aware of what panorama is? Not the photographic panorama, but the idea that you have this kind of 360 representation of a space, and that you can then reconstruct and have almost like a virtual reality effect. And then I was looking at the National Museum as well, because first of all, it was a site that was talking about putting forward an image of the history of Scotland. And its architects had specifically, so it was kind of building up this touristical impression of the city, and Edinburgh is a touristical product, like very prominently. But it was also admittedly trying to do so through the building itself, setting out views into the city as real-life postcards. And I thought that was very interesting and a way into the idea of the postcard and the perception of the tourist as a visitor. And then I was looking at Edinburgh Castle, and as relating to the bird's eye view, and this kind of oblique view of the city. So And lastly, there was the Arthur seat, which was a volcanic mass of terrain that had emerged from a prehistoric eruption, as relating to the geological map and the geological past of the city. And each one of those, I will have to go back, I thought there was more. Yeah, so each one of those was then relating to a character that I was mapping. So, so these 6 sites, these 6 optical devices set out, first of all, an object for me to look at, the subject matter, that had to do with characters that would embody within the drawing the ways of representing the city, but also the ways of looking at the city, and kind of making clear that these are not necessarily one and the same. So for the Royal Observatory, I was looking at the stars. For the aerial view of the observation tower, I was looking at the planes that approach the city to land in the nearby airport. For the panorama, I think I was looking at the, okay, now I'm confused. I think I've made a mistake here. I was looking at the tourist anyway. That was one of my characters. I thought I was looking at the tourist. Anyway, I'm a bit confused now. I'm missing one character because 3 by 6 is 18. It's too many to remember now after so many years. Sorry. For the bird's eye view, I was looking at the seagulls that are a very prominent feature of Edinburgh as well. And they are birds, and we try to imitate their view of the city. And for the geological map in Arthur Seat, I was looking actually at the land itself. So I thought, I don't really care about the buildings per se, but I do care about the land, because it is not arbitrary that every time it is the high points that kind of, it's almost like the land turning back at itself to look at itself. So this became a drawing. Actually, it became different layers of drawings. But if it was a plan, it was hard to kind of put it all in a one flat plane, because, as I said, there were things that were high above you. So I had to think as well how these characters were not only about how I was producing the drawing, but were also about how I would put the drawing out there for people to read. As I was saying earlier, it's both about how you look at the city and how you then look at the representation. So what I did, and Tonya has seen this live, I have to say, right? You were there. So I installed this in a gallery in Edinburgh for a symposium that we were both in a few years ago. And I thought, instead of printing this onto paper, this is where the idea of the kaleidoscope became more prominent. And I started to look at these characters as lenses that were kind of conditioning perceptions of the city. So I laser engraved these notations that were mostly having to do with a parallel projection along the axis of the land, okay, of the terrain. So I laser engraved this onto a series of transparent cast acrylic layers that, in a sense of embodying both the kaleidoscopic qualities of the city that I was talking about, and this idea of the transversal section that we can trace back to the Charles and Ray Eames moving downwards and upwards away from the land. So a kind of transversal section that is embodied. These are the individual, the trace of the individual characters, sorry, to go one step back. So the tourist, the terrain, so you can see here the influence from the geological map and its notations, the movement of the ether by means of the planes that had to do with the aerial view, the star constellation, the movements, the seagull. The terrain doubled, I think. It was kind of, yeah, because it was between the Edinburgh Castle and the Arthur Seat viewpoints. So, yeah, here's a bit of a diagram of the kind of views that, relating to the square that defines the site, that these different perspectives created. So, how they became embodied gradually into the into the drawing, not only by means of the mapping of these characters that I was following and recording, but also in terms of offering devices for reading, for looking at the drawing itself. So Arthur's seat became a kind of compass, a kind of legend for the whole of the drawing, setting out the lines of the terrain. The Royal Observatory became about, worked with the camera obscura observation tower to offer a reading of the, a directed reading of the whole installation from above, and so on. I will not go into too much detail because there's quite a lot going on, but I think you will understand more when you see the images of the installation itself. So in the sentiment, let's say, of the kaleidoscope, then these kind of separate layers of drawing offered an array of lenses that kind of brought into attention the data, let's say, the information that was to be communicated. But then it was almost as if, you know, when you have a drawing and you have different layers, when you flatten these layers, they begin to operate on one another. So they begin to speak to one another, and maybe one becomes more dominant, and there is a hierarchy that comes to be established in the plan. But by these layers staying apart, the traces of the characters that I mentioned earlier, so the stars, the planes, shuffling the ether, there was also a component of the solid city that was corresponding to the so the outlines of the buildings in that kind of oblique view, having to do with the oblique view of the city, the bird's eye view. And on the lower levels, the lower one corresponds to the geological movements of the materials of the ground, and the second one from below corresponds to the ground of the city that we move on and experience, and it kind of collects the characters such as the tourist, the seagull, and so on. So more familiar to us. Yeah. So these were embodied then. So for instance, this is the observatory, defining a view for looking into a mirror above, a replica of the mirror in the camera obscura in Edinburgh that will give a view of the whole thing from above, flattening it with the privileging of the top view. Just the layers. This was the incarnation, let's say, of the Carlton Hill point of view that operated as a telescope that would let you kind of zoom into the detail of the tourist movement across the city, which was engraved, oops, yeah, some transcription from the tourists, which was engraved into these kind of little slits of activity, bringing even the scale of a tiny person into this overall all-encompassing, let's say, hopefully, representation. Here's the detail from that. Here's the movement of the seagull, and how these devices will specifically kind of stage the body to move around the drawing, and the terrain, which had to do with kind of helping you through engravings identify what you were looking at. But the key, this is not working. Sorry, this was meant to be an animation, but I think I flattened it in the PDF. The key idea was then that even though this was, so this was not meant to be an alternative that, oh, this is how we draw, but it was kind of trying to make a point about what we bring into our drawings and what we make visible into our drawings, and therefore what we take into account in our understanding of the city as architects and as designers. And the key into this animation and to the reading of this drawing was that there were multiple ways of reading it, so it was never one and the same. But the primary way of reading it was through the movement around it. So not necessarily only through the sole specific points that you were looking through, but also by moving around it and through this transparency, capturing the provisional relationships between the different layers. So it was kind of trying to bring to the fore this idea of, to put an emphasis on the reader of the drawing and of the architect as well as someone who doesn't only construct the drawing, but equally to the architectural space needs to kind of occupy it and move around it. So to highlight this embodied idea of visually appropriating the drawing. So this is the Kaleidoscopic City. So these are kind of views that are not from the specific sites, but kind of from arbitrarily looking around it. And you can see that you could consider that each one of them is a singular drawing, but none of them is ever the same as the other. So as in the kaleidoscope, it was kind of trying to highlight not a good way of looking at the city, but a way of looking at the multiplicity of the city. Thank you.